Donald Trump believed the Supreme Court was his safe haven, but today, the justices he himself chose have just pulled the rug out from under him. Let's analyze the historic collapse that occurred after the Supreme Court declared his tariffs unconstitutional. But first, leave a like and comment below with your opinion and tell us where you're reporting from.
Tony, I think we can say this is one of the most significant Supreme Court losses for a U.S. president in modern history. I mean, the justices invalidating a key part of President Trump's economic policy agenda. And this afternoon, like you said, he blasted the court and said the fight for tariffs wasn't over.
I'm ashamed of certain members of the court.
An angry President Trump lashed out at the justices, turning his ire on three of the court's conservatives, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, justices he put on the court, and Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the opinion.
They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
The three joined with the court's three liberal justices to rule that the federal emergency trade law that gives presidents power to regulate imports did not authorize President Trump to impose tariffs. Said the Chief Justice, had Congress intended to convey the distinct and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, it would have done so expressly. The ruling invalidates 10%.
There is a specific kind of political irony that only becomes visible in hindsight. And then, once you see it, you cannot look away from it. Donald Trump spent years telling his supporters that the Supreme Court was the reason to vote for him. Not the platform, not the policy specifics. The court, 3 seats, a generational realignment of the judiciary toward conservative constitutional principles. That was the promise, and it was the promise that held together a coalition fractured on almost every other question. You may not like everything about him, but the court was why. He delivered. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett. 3 confirmations that conservatives had been building toward for decades. The culmination of a judicial strategy that stretched back to the Federalist Society's founding. Trump presented those confirmations not as institutional service, but as personal achievement. My justices, my legacy, my insurance policy. On the day the Supreme Court handed down its 6-3 ruling invalidating the centerpiece of his second-term economic agenda, 2 of those 3 appointments were in the majority, and within minutes of the decision circulating in Washington, Trump was on live television calling them traitors. What you are about to watch unfold across this video is not simply the story of a president losing a court case. It is the story of what happens when the theory a president has been operating under, that institutional loyalty follows political investment, that the people he confirmed owe him protection in return, collides publicly and irreversibly with the reality that constitutional officers apply principles, not loyalty. And it is the story of what that collision means for every pillar of his second-term governing strategy simultaneously on the same day. My name is Matthew John Turner. The ruling is documented. The implications are precise. Let's work through them carefully.
Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Melanie Zanona in Washington, where the president is lashing out at the Supreme Court, threatening to use his power to destroy economic rivals, and vowing a global tariff in response to the Supreme Court today dealing a serious blow to his signature economic policy, striking down most of the tariffs that his administration has imposed. The ruling raising many questions about what comes next for the White House's economic agenda, and also what happens to the billions of dollars it has already collected from those tariffs, which are now determined to be unconstitutional. 2 of the president's Supreme Court picks, as well as Chief Justice John Roberts, joined the court's liberal justices in the historic 6-3 decision, ruling that the president exceeded his authority in using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose those sweeping tariffs on numerous countries. Chief Justice Roberts writing, quote, "The framers gave Congress alone the power to impose tariffs during peacetime."
What the court actually decided and why the legal principle applies. Let me begin with the specific legal mechanism the court applied, as understanding it is fundamental to understanding why the implications of this decision go far beyond the immediate tariff issue. The majority opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts was based on the principal issues doctrine, a principle that the conservative wing of the court has developed and applied with increasing consistency in recent years. What do you think? Leave your opinion in the comments. The doctrine holds that when the executive branch claims authority of enormous economic or political importance based on a general legal provision, the courts require that Congress has clearly and specifically authorized that claim. The test is not whether a creative legal argument can find legal language that can be interpreted as supporting the authority. The test is whether Congress has in fact addressed the specific issue being decided explicitly and unequivocally. The statute Trump was relying on to impose sweeping global tariffs was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a law that grants presidents broad authority to regulate international commerce in response to declared national emergencies. Trump had declared economic emergencies and invoked IEEPA to impose tariff regimes covering dozens of countries simultaneously, including baseline rates that applied universally and escalating rates for specific trading partners. The tariff architecture was designed to function as a permanent restructuring of American trade relationships, imposed through executive declaration without congressional authorization. The court's ruling said IEEPA did not authorize this. More specifically, Congress did not clearly authorize permanent sweeping global tariff authority through the general emergency language of IEEPA, particularly given that in the 50-year history of the statute, no previous president had ever attempted to use it this way. That historical absence matters as constitutional evidence. If the authority had been understood to exist by the legal and political actors operating under the statute for 5 decades, previous presidents facing trade challenges would have used it. They did not. The absence of prior use is evidence that the authority was not understood to exist. That reasoning, clear authorization required, general language insufficient, historical practice as evidence, does not apply only to IEEPA tariffs. It applies to every emergency authority claim built on the same structural theory, that a general emergency statute combined with a presidential declaration transfers legislative scale authority from Congress to the executive. Immigration emergency declarations using vague statutory language. Domestic security measures claimed under general emergency authority. Foreign policy economic coercion mechanisms substituting presidential declaration for congressional authorization. Every one of those claims now faces the same constitutional framework the court articulated in this ruling. The major questions doctrine, with 2 Trump appointees in the majority, now governs how courts across the entire federal judicial system evaluate emergency authority claims of this scope. The ruling does not end Trump's ability to impose tariffs through statutory mechanisms that clearly authorize them. Section 232 national security tariffs operate under a statute with more specific authority. Section 301 unfair trade practice tariffs similarly, but those statutes impose substantive limits on scope and duration. They are not blank checks. And they require engaging with the institutional constraints, reporting requirements, congressional review windows, factual findings, that the emergency declaration route was designed to bypass. The blank check is constitutionally gone, and the governing strategy built on the blank check bypass Congress through emergency declarations, reshape global trade relationships through executive decree, use economic coercion as diplomatic leverage without legislative authorization, faces a constitutional wall that cannot be walked around with a differently worded executive order. The Gorsuch and Barrett dimension, what conservative justices applying conservative doctrine actually means the composition of the majority is as legally significant as the holding itself, and it requires direct analytical attention rather than being treated as a political footnote. This was not a 5-4 ruling driven by the court's liberal bloc, plus 1 or 2 moderate votes that the administration could characterize as partisan judicial opposition. This was 6-3, with Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, 2 of Trump's 3 first-term appointments, joining Chief Justice Roberts and all 3 liberal justices in the majority. Gorsuch's confirmation in 2017 was the culmination of Mitch McConnell's unprecedented decision to hold the seat open for nearly a year after Justice Scalia's death, denying Barack Obama his appointment and reserving it for a Republican president. Trump presented that confirmation as a foundational achievement of his first term, a demonstration that the judicial appointment strategy had worked. Barrett's 2020 confirmation rushed through in the final weeks of the first term, confirmed 8 days before the election, was presented as the completion of that legacy, the capstone of a judicial transformation that would shape American law for a generation. Both of those justices reviewed the emergency tariff authority claim, applied the major questions doctrine, the specific conservative constitutional principle that the Federalist Society legal movement spent decades developing and that their nominations were supposed to champion, and concluded the claim was constitutionally insufficient. Congress did not clearly authorize this. The authority fails. This is not liberal judicial activism. This is conservative jurisprudence applied consistently. The major questions doctrine is not a liberal legal invention. It is the doctrine that conservative legal scholars built, argued for in academic literature, and appellate briefs over decades, and celebrated when the court's conservative supermajority adopted it as governing doctrine. Trump's appointments were confirmed precisely because they were expected to apply that doctrine rigorously. They did. The result happened to constrain a claim of authority that a Republican president was asserting because the doctrine applies to vast authority claims regardless of who is making them. That consistency, conservative justices applying conservative principles to produce a ruling that constrains a Republican president, is constitutionally healthy. It is evidence that the court is functioning as an institution governed by legal principles rather than as a partisan protection mechanism. And it sends a signal through every level of the federal judiciary. If the Supreme Court with its conservative supermajority applies major questions doctrine to strike down this emergency authority claim, every lower court judge evaluating every other emergency power challenge has the most authoritative possible support for applying the same framework rigorously. The united stand is not an accident. It is the institutional independence of the court expressing itself in the most visible and consequential possible way. The meltdown, what My Own Justices reveals about the theory being operated under Trump's live televised response to the ruling, deserves analytical attention that goes beyond the optics of a president losing composure in public. The specific language he used is the most revealing element of the episode. My own justices. That possessive my is doing enormous work in a very small space. It encapsulates a theory of the judiciary that is constitutionally wrong in a foundational way, and it exposes that theory at precisely the moment the theory was demonstrably falsified by the institution it was applied to. Under the theory, the phrase reveals, confirming a justice creates a personal obligation. The president who nominated and fought for a justice's confirmation is owed something in return. Favorable rulings, institutional protection, loyalty expressed through judicial outcomes that advantage the appointing president. Under this theory, an unfavorable ruling, a ruling that applies constitutional principles to constrain the appointing president's authority, is not a constitutional determination, it is a betrayal, a failure to repay the debt that the confirmation created. That theory is constitutionally wrong in a way that is not a matter of reasonable disagreement. Justices do not owe the presidents who appointed them loyalty. They are not political allies confirmed to a lifetime position. They are constitutional officers who have taken an oath to apply the law independently and honestly, regardless of the political identity of the parties whose conduct they are evaluating. The confirmation process creates a constitutional officer. It does not create a personal obligation to the nominating president. The meltdown is revealing precisely because it is not controlled political communication. A controlled political communication would have acknowledged the ruling, expressed disagreement through measured legal language, and vowed to pursue alternative statutory authority through Congress. What Trump delivered instead was the unfiltered expression of a man confronting, apparently for the first time in real time, the reality that the institutions he invested in do not operate according to the theory he held about them. The justices he calls my own are not his. They are the Constitution's. And the Constitution's justices applied the Constitution to his conduct and found it wanting. The public nature of the meltdown compounds the political damage in ways that extend across every arena simultaneously. Markets watching the response saw a president surprised to discover that constitutional limits apply to his economic authority, which is information about the reliability of his economic policy commitments going forward. Foreign governments watching saw an administration whose primary mechanism for delivering delivering economic threats had been ruled unconstitutional and whose president's response was to attack the court that ruled against him, which is information about how credibly that mechanism can be threatened in future negotiations. Republican members calculating their 2026 positioning saw a president having a live institutional breakdown over a ruling from justices he appointed, which is information about how closely their electoral prospects should be tied to his governing record. All of that information landed simultaneously on live television in the president's own words. The second-term governing strategy collapse, what the ruling removes and what remains. The tariff authority was not a peripheral policy tool. It was load-bearing structural architecture for the entire second-term economic and foreign policy approach. The governing logic of the second term depended heavily on the ability to use economic pressure through unilateral executive declaration to reshape relationships with every major trading partner simultaneously: China, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, without the delays, compromises, and institutional friction that working through Congress requires. The congressional route would require legislative majorities, committee processes, conference negotiations, and the kind of transparent deliberation that exposes policy to public scrutiny and partisan opposition. The emergency declaration route bypassed all of that. A presidential declaration, EPA authority, immediate implementation. The speed and scale of the approach were themselves strategic assets, moving faster than adversaries could respond, establishing facts on the ground before domestic political opposition could organize. The court has ruled that constitutional shortcut closed. The administration can pursue trade policy through the statutory mechanisms that clearly authorize specific types of tariff action. But those mechanisms operate within substantive limits that constrain their scope and duration. They require engaging with congressional oversight processes. They cannot be used to impose the kind of sweeping, permanent, globally comprehensive restructuring that the IEEPA emergency route was designed to deliver. The Iran strategy deserves specific attention here because the tariff ruling landed on a strategic architecture that was already under simultaneous stress from multiple directions. The Iran approach combined military pressure, Operation Epic Fury, with all the war powers and constitutional questions that generated, with economic coercion delivered through the tariff threat mechanism. That combination, military pressure plus economic consequence, was the leverage architecture. The court's ruling removed the economic component of that leverage at the exact moment the military component was generating impeachment articles from nearly 100 co-signers, Senate walkouts, and war crimes concerns that were reaching into previously reliable Republican constituencies. The strategic architecture of the second term is being dismantled not through a single decisive event, but through a systematic accumulation of judicial rulings and institutional constraints, each one targeting a specific mechanism the administration was counting on and each one compounding the effect of the ones that preceded it. The international credibility dimension, what foreign governments are calculating right now, every foreign government that has been assessing the credibility of American economic threats over the past year received meaningful new information from this ruling, and the information is not favorable to the administration's negotiating position. The tariff regime's effectiveness as diplomatic leverage depended in part on its perceived permanence and credibility. If foreign governments believed that tariff threats could be sustained at their stated levels and escalated further without legal constraint, the economic pressure was real and the incentive to negotiate compliance was real. The credibility of the threat was itself a strategic asset. The Supreme Court ruling changed that calculation in a single decision. Every government that has been evaluating whether to comply with American economic demands now knows that the primary mechanism for delivering those consequences, broad emergency tariff authority under IEEPA, has been ruled unconstitutional by the president's own court. The threat is legally constrained. The mechanism is blocked. The alternative statutory routes are narrower in scope and more limited in duration. The economic leverage the administration has been projecting is not as available as it appeared to be when it was being exercised. This credibility erosion is not recoverable through a social media post or a subsequent executive order. Foreign governments making real trade and diplomatic decisions are staffed by analysts who read Supreme Court opinions and assess their implications for American negotiating capacity. They are now working with an updated assessment of what American economic coercion can actually deliver, and that assessment is materially less favorable to the administration's position than the assessment that preceded the ruling. For an administration that has consistently presented itself as the most economically aggressive and economically powerful in modern American history, as the one that finally made trading partners comply where previous administrations failed, having the Supreme Court publicly rule that the central mechanism of that economic aggressiveness exceeded constitutional authority is a credibility blow that compounds with every subsequent negotiation. The political cascade, how this ruling interacts with everything else. The tariff ruling did not land in a vacuum. It landed on a political environment already shaped by a specific accumulation of institutional confrontations, and its arrival adds to that accumulation in ways that are qualitatively significant rather than merely additive. The impeachment articles, the Senate walkout over the Iran war, the martial law emergency order, and the federal court finding that the administration's governing pattern displays martial law logic. The suburban electoral swings that showed up in special election results as early leading indicators of 2026 voter sentiment. Each of those elements was already in the political environment when the tariff ruling arrived. The ruling does not exist in isolation from them. It becomes part of the same accumulating picture. Every Republican member running in a competitive 2026 district is now making calculations that have to account for all of it simultaneously. An administration whose signature economic policy was ruled unconstitutional by its own Supreme Court. An Iran war generating impeachment articles from nearly 100 congressional co-signers. A governing pattern that a federal court characterized in language evoking martial law. A president who responded to a judicial rebuke from his own appointees by having a live televised breakdown calling them traitors. The accumulation is not merely political background noise. It is the pressure system being built in real time that will define the structural environment of the 2026 midterms. And each new element, each institutional rebuke, each judicial ruling, each congressional confrontation makes the next one more politically costly for Republican members to defend and more visible to the suburban and independent voters whose movement toward or away from the administration will determine the chamber outcomes. The special election results that analysts have been reading as early 2026 indicators showed shifts in exactly the constituencies. College-educated suburban voters, independent women, working-class voters in areas economically dependent on stable trade relationships, most directly affected by the combination of tariff economic disruption and institutional credibility erosion the ruling represents. The reign of unlimited emergency power as a governing strategy has ended. The court drew the line. The meltdown confirmed in real time that the man who built the strategy did not anticipate that the line existed where the Constitution always placed it. Let me state the record with precision, because precision is the only tool that cuts through the noise this story generates. The documented facts of the ruling: the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 decision invalidating the administration's sweeping tariff regime imposed through IEPA emergency authority. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, Trump's first-term appointments, joined Roberts and the court's 3 liberal justices in the majority. The holding rested on the major questions doctrine. Congress did not clearly authorize permanent sweeping global tariff authority through the general emergency language of IEEPA, and the 50-year history of the statute without any prior president attempting to use it this way supports the inference that the authority was never understood to exist. The ruling does not eliminate the president's ability to impose tariffs through statutory mechanisms that specifically authorize them. It eliminates the blank check theory, the claim that a general emergency declaration transfers legislative-scale economic authority from Congress to the executive. The documented facts of the response, within minutes of the ruling circulating, Trump appeared on live television, called his own appointees unpatriotic and disloyal, described the ruling as a betrayal and an act of sabotage, used the phrase "my own justices" in a way that reveals a foundational theory of judicial appointments as the creation of personal obligations rather than the staffing of an independent constitutional institution. That theory is constitutionally wrong and was publicly falsified in real time by the very justices the theory was applied to. The documented implications. The major questions doctrine, as applied in this ruling, now governs every emergency authority claim built on the same blank check structure. The strategic architecture of the second term, bypassing congressional authorization through emergency declarations, using economic coercion as diplomatic leverage without legislative constraints, faces a constitutional wall that cannot be circumvented through executive order. Foreign governments have received updated information about the credibility and legal availability of American economic threats. Republican members in competitive districts are recalibrating their relationship with an administration whose signature economic policy was ruled unconstitutional by its own court. What the ruling does not do, it does not end Trump's calendar term. It does not remove the administration's ability to pursue trade policy through properly authorized statutory mechanisms. It does not resolve the separate impeachment, war powers, and judicial compliance questions that are accumulating in parallel. Here is what I want you to sit with, because it connects directly to the thread running through every story I have covered on this channel. When the court a president built, staffed with his own appointments, shaped by his own political capital, presented to his supporters as his personal constitutional legacy, applies the constitutional principles those appointments were confirmed to champion, and rules that his governing strategy exceeded the authority Congress actually granted him. What does it tell us about the gap between how presidential power has been presented to the American public and how the Constitution actually distributes it? That gap between the mythology of unlimited presidential power and the constitutional reality that the separation of powers enforces is the through line connecting the immunity ruling, the civil fraud judgment, the Epstein document contradictions, and now this tariff decision. Each story is different in its facts and its legal domain. Each one is a data point in the same structural picture. The court drew the line in writing. The meltdown confirmed that the man who crossed it was surprised to find it there. The line was always where the Constitution placed it. This is Matthew John Turner. The ruling is public. The doctrine is documented. The implications are still unfolding, and this channel will be here tracking every one of them.